and welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Joan Baxter. She's from Canada, from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. She currently lives in Mali, in Africa. She's written 3 books about her life there. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Leslie.
Joan, I want to take you back to your big move from Nova Scotia to Africa. How much did you know, and what was it like?
I knew absolutely nothing. I think, in fact, that was the most devastating thing at all. It's not what I found in Africa. It's the fact that this continent existed with 53 countries. There were capitals to which jetliners were flying absolutely every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. And I couldn't have named probably 10 countries on the continent. The capital cities I didn't know, and I really realized that there was something missing in our education system, because I think I did Africa in grade 4. If I remember correctly, and I think it was in a social studies class, which probably doesn't exist anymore, and we did somebody called Bunga, this little African boy who lived in a village with banana trees around, and it absolutely captured my imagination then. But I hadn't really advanced from that stage when I headed off the first time to Africa. In fact, I was going to a country I'd never heard of.
You flew in from North America, ultimately, and you landed there. And where did you land?
I landed in Niamey. And I can say
Which is where?
Niamey is the capital of Niger, which I can tell you now lies north of Nigeria, west of Chad, east of Burkina Faso, which at that time was Upper Volta, south of Algeria, and also borders on Togo. I have the map in my head now, but when I flew off, I might as well have been flying to the moon.
What was the effect? You're on the ground, you're driving through the streets, you're finding a place to live.
I remember coming in from the airport when we landed. First of all, it was extraordinarily hot. I was not prepared for that furnace heat that hits you when you get out of the airplane for the first time. And driving down, most African countries that lived under dictatorship for 30 years after independence have absolutely stunning boulevards leading in from the airport, and that's as far as the roads go, or to the presidential palace. And so when you came into Niamey, which is really mostly desert, it only has the Niger River flowing through. It's mud dwellings with thatch or tin roofs. It's very squalid by Canadian definitions. But there was this boulevard with military jets parked on one side, because there's a lot of military. There had been a lot of military input and aid and so on into some of these countries during the Cold War. And this boulevard with huge streetlights over it, stunning boulevard, and on all sides were people living with old car bodies as walls around their compounds, and people on foot, and amazing poverty by the usual definition of poverty, which means lack of money. And I couldn't reconcile the contradictions I saw.
I have the feeling you still can't reconcile the contradictions, because I've read your books.
I don't think anybody can reconcile the incredible contrast between the wealth of the oligarchy, of that elite that stays in place in Africa. There's almost no middle class in any country, perhaps, except South Africa. And the rest of the population, which is, even the educated, what would be middle class here, the professionals, are living on salaries of $100 or $200 a month. And it's not, as many people would say, oh, well, it's cheap to live there. It's not. If you want a Western living style, in most of the countries I've lived in, it costs 4 times more than it would here.
Okay, now you're not helping the tourist industry. I got that. But you've lived in Africa how long now?
The first time I flew there was in, 1982. Mm-hmm. And I've lived there basically ever since. I think the longest stint out of Africa was for 6 months in 1988.
Okay, you've made a commitment to Africa. You just told me a number of things that make it sound like not a very attractive place. You love Africa.
Well, that's a contradiction in my head. It is a wonderful continent full of incredibly strong, resilient, mostly humorous people with incredible amounts of faith, be it Islam or Christianity, faith that God is there and that justice will be meted out at some point to those people who have done them wrong.
Despite the poverty, despite the disparity of wealth.
Yes, and I don't like to speak, there are countries where incredible atrocities have gone on. Those are the countries that Canadians have heard about: Rwanda, Somalia, Sierra Leone most recently, Liberia, where war is ongoing and has been for years, Sudan, where there's a war that's been going on for 25 years. Largely, I must say, aided and abetted by foreign interests, because they have not got the funds to arm themselves. and there were always interests involved in those wars. But the countries I've lived in have not been wars where there are countries where there are ongoing wars, or there have been outbreaks of, there have been ethnic clashes and so on. But basically, it's a whole continent of really hardworking people struggling every single day to make it through to the next day.
I hear this paradox again that keeps coming out again. Tell me about where you live now. You live just down the road from Timbuktu.
I do. In fact, when I leave Halifax International Airport, every single time, after they finish checking me in, they say, "Where is Bamako?"
Bamako is the name of the city.
That's the capital of Mali. So then I say, well, it's in Mali, and they still look blank. So I say, that's in West Africa, and they still look blank. So then I say, well, have you heard of Timbuktu? And they think I'm putting them on. And I said, well, actually, Timbuktu is in Mali. So it's hard to find anybody who really knows much about the Sahelian countries in West Africa, which are actually some of my favorite and also the poorest part of the planet. With good reason, because there's not much there except desert.
But you live in the capital.
We live in the capital, which is on the Niger River, which flows all the way from Guinea right across and then down through Nigeria. It's the lifeblood of West Africa. Without that river, there wouldn't be life in the Sahelian countries.
But it's the capital, so it must be a very civilized place. You have electricity, you have hospitals, you have schools, you have those sorts of things?
You use the word civilized. I would say it's been civilized for thousands of years.
Okay.
Actually, Timbuktu was home to the very first university in the world,
Yes.
1,000 years ago. And Mali was a center of great empires in West Africa. In fact, in 1300s already, the emperor of what is today Mali, and included 4 other countries, traveled to Mecca, and the world gold price fell in half. And the Romans were just absolutely bowled over by all of these emperors that they met from the Malian empires. There were several empires at the time.
But you didn't answer
my question. So civilization has been there for a long time. As for the modern amenities, there are some big problems. It's the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th poorest country in the world based on average annual income, and also by all the other human development indicators, how many children die before they're 5 and so on, electricity, health facilities, schools. It's really in bad shape, but they're trying. Electricity is almost exclusively provided by huge hydro dams that were built in the heydays of the 60s and 70s and 80s, when we'll just dam up all the rivers. No, they don't, because there's not enough water to keep them running all year round.
It's a very dry country, as you've
explained. It's a very dry country.
Wouldn't it be a bad idea to build a dam?
One has to question the wisdom of the international financing the agencies, the IMF and World Bank, and the donor countries in the West that finance these enormous hydro dams in a place where water is the most precious and scarce resource.
Isn't the idea to help the people there? We are helping the people of Africa by putting money into their country?
One would like to think so. But after 17 years in Africa, it really looks as if, on one hand, the individuals who are involved in development assistance, especially at the lower levels in the church groups, the non-governmental organizations, the charities that we contribute to here in Canada, the individuals who work there at that level with small budgets are really well-intentioned, and their work has a big impact. But at the higher levels, it's politics and it's economics.
Tell me about those individuals, or give me one individual. Maybe Karen Leslie is a Canadian who was there. She does make a difference. And what did she do? Who was she?
Karen Leslie she died 2 years ago of an aneurysm suddenly in her sleep, and to me it was a real loss, because Karen, to me, was the quintessential Canadian woman in her 50s. She already had grandchildren. She was an early childhood educator, and she actually came out to Ghana, which is where we were living at the time in the late 80s and early 90s, as the spouse of her husband was going to be working in the hydro. In fact, he was with Ontario Hydro, and it was an exchange program where he would come over and contribute to the Volta River Authority when they were bringing the electricity to the north of the country. Leslie didn't even work for any agencies. She had no budget whatsoever, and yet within 2 months she had herself developing a kindergarten in the orphanage, which was a really sad place. There was just no money at all for these orphan kids in this building that had no roof anymore. In locally started kindergartens, early childhood education was a very new concept in Tamale at the time. In fact, it was a revolution that you would actually take kids at a very early age and start building on skills, foundation skills. It was a completely new concept for the people in northern Ghana. But there were some Ghanaians who had lived abroad who were interested, so they immediately solicited Leslie's service, Karen's services. And it was remarkable what she did.
It worked. She made a difference.
She made such a difference because the willingness is there. If somebody does come to Africa with things that interest people and they are asking for it, they're not imposing an idea, their people are already asking for something, it works incredibly quickly.
That's amazing. It's
incredibly quickly. And she had no budget whatsoever, but she did it all out of the goodness of her heart. And I returned to Ghana earlier this year and talked to people in Tamale, and they still just spoke about what Karen Leslie had done for the schools of that area. Her legacy will live on forever.
Well, that's encouraging. And you write about amazing people in your 3 books, Graveyard for Dreamers, Strangers Are Like Children, and the new one that is subtitled Letters from Africa. Another very interesting person, an African, comes up. His name is Gabriel. He lives in Cameroon. Tell me about Gabriel.
Well, normally I suppose I shouldn't have interviewed Gabriel. I did it, but I did it with a Cameroonian colleague who's also a journalist. And Gabriel is actually somebody whom the Cameroonians define as a fou, which in French means a crazy man. In Anglophone countries, they call them market lunatics because there are very few psychiatric facilities in Africa. Anybody who's not, quote, normal is basically allowed to roam free and rant at the heavens or adorn themselves in bits of garbage they pick up along the way. It's a hands-off policy. People don't bother them, they don't bother people, and the cities are full of them.
And Gabriel was unique, though.
Really full of them. Now, Gabriel was somebody, because we had been driving through Yaoundé, which is the capital of Cameroon, for several hours trying to do official interviews with big ministers and officials, none of whom wanted to meet with us. Cameroon has recently gone through this so-called democratic process, which means now that there are elections at least. You have the same president, but you have elections. So there is more openness than there was, but it still doesn't mean that it's easy to operate as a journalist. And the taxi driver kept pointing out this man who was slaving in his bare back in the raging sun in front of it's actually the mairie, which is not really the mayor's office, it's kind of a town hall in Yaoundé. And what he had done to this piece of bare mud was he'd excavated the whole thing, built mud walls around it, painted them all up, done some kind of sculptures, picked up bits of garbage, fenced it all in, written notes to God on the walls and on blackboards.
Directly to God.
Directly to God.
God to be listening.
Directly to God. And the taxi driver said, well, look at this crazy man, because he keeps doing this. He's beautifying the city, but every time he does, the town hall sends out a big grader and raises his work to the ground because it's embarrassing to them. That a man like this, who's a crazy man, can accomplish something that the entire structure of municipal government can't do, especially in the capital. So we stopped. As I say, I was with a Cameroonian colleague who felt more free than I did as a foreigner to point his microphone in front of Gabriel's mouth. And Gabriel told us that he's not crazy, that it's God's work, and he's actually met God, and God is a woman, but a hermaphroditic woman, and he's actually had a child with her, and it's her instruction, and she sent invisible ones who protect him during the day, and that the world is a mess, and that his job is to beautify that part of town. And if people want to call him crazy, they can, but only God can define what crazy is.
Did you think he was crazy?
At the end of the day, when we drove away from there, I have to say I didn't really think he was crazy at all.
What was there? There was something there beyond it. The way you just described him to me.
I've heard that same kind of rhetoric from a lot of very deeply religious and faithful people.
He was a believer.
And he was definitely a believer. I asked him, what was the name of his religion, and he just said he was a believer. He knew God. And he also felt that he listed off a whole bunch of heads of state whom he was sure would really appreciate his work if they could see it. Now the sad thing is that briefly, it was not even a month after I had been there, I heard on one of the international shortwave stations that they had knocked it down again. And the public is getting very upset because the public is starting to really support this crazy man who's doing this labor of love.
Kind of
and creating sculpture and a work of art in progress, and they keep coming and knocking it down with their graders, which are not available when they want work done on the roads. So it was an absolutely fascinating encounter with this man.
What did he say to you when you asked if you could take his picture?
It was the first thing I asked him, actually. And he said it wasn't up to him to say yes or no. He said that it was up to God, and if God didn't think my intentions were honorable, that the camera would likely explode.
You took the picture anyway.
And then I tried to decide whether my intentions were really honorable, whether I was being somewhat voyeuristic here or in taking these photographs of this man. And I decided that curiosity was probably an honorable intention. And I took the photographs and nothing happened. In fact, I think they're very beautiful photographs.
But some of the people you were with decided to...
No, the taxi driver and the
distance.
public definitely
Yes.
kept
Yeah.
a big
Okay.
distance, a big, very big distance.
And
from
maybe
this
for
scene.
good reason. It seems to me that religion is much more the day-to-day central part of life in Africa in a very, very different way than it is here. Is that true?
Absolutely.
In what way? How does it manifest itself? What do people say to you, or how do they act?
Every single phrase, well, I'll see you tomorrow, or every single phrase has a suffix that is, if God wills it. There's this complete belief that human beings basically have no control over their own destinies. And certainly for most people, I'd say that's probably true.
Yeah.
There's very little social mobility in Africa, unless it's through the church or perhaps through the army, where you might become a president if you throw out the former government. And so people's lot in life is really that, you know, God is watching over us. There's a reason that it's this way. And if I pray enough, I'll have enough to eat, and my children will be able to go to school, and the rains will come. And it is. Everything seems to be in hands much further up. There isn't this belief that they can control and plan ahead and change all of these things. Now you find it among the urban, educated people. It's very different, but they're still very religious.
Yes.
But they do make plans and try to change because they have the profession, so they can get some income. Maybe they get a job with an international agency, or they're computer people who can actually set up a private company and make it go in a capital city.
But the religion is
But the religion is
there,
still there.
very, very
It's
powerful
still
and
there.
strong.
And the irony to me is that I get preached at all the time. You know, I grew up as a fairly secular, agnostic Canadian. I
Yes.
mean, I didn't have to think ahead. Security seemed like it was there. I didn't think about what I was going to study, what job I was going to have, where I would be living. It just seemed like I could control that as I went along. Security was never a question to me.
Until you got to Africa. And
Until
it sounds
I
like
got
you
to
got completely
Africa.
re-educated. I'm going to sort of take a little break right now, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute. My guest today is Joan Baxter. We're talking about her books about Africa, and we'll be back right after this. And welcome back to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Joan Baxter. We're talking about her experiences in Africa. We've been talking about West Africa, and you've lived in several countries, and recently you had been living in Nairobi, Kenya. And I gather from what I've read in the manuscripts and in the books that this was a very, very different kind of experience there. You write about carjackings, you know, people reach in and yank you out of the car, if you're lucky maybe, and steal your car, that sort of thing. But it sounds like a very dangerous place, the urban setting of Nairobi.
There could be some weekends when, in Nairobi itself, 25 cars were taken at gunpoint, and I think the recovery rate is, you know, maybe 1 or 2 of those cars.
Right. I know one country is very much different from the next, but you've traveled around West Africa and talked to many women about their situations, especially in rural areas, farming economies, and that sort of thing. What is it like for them as individuals?
Their lives are one long, hard toiling to the self-sacrifice that I see among rural African women. And there I'd say that probably doesn't differ very much between countries. It depends on how lush the country is and how difficult farming is and how difficult it is to eke something out of the soil. But the rural women rise before the sun comes up. They usually have to trek for water unless they're fortunate enough to have a well in the village, which is one of the very positive things that development assistance has done over the last 30 years, is get wells to villages. Then they have to chop firewood Then they raise the children, they bear the and they do a lot of the farming. In some countries, they do almost all of the farming. It depends. It's very ethnicity specific and country specific. But they're absolutely remarkable because they still get together in groups when they're trekking off to collect their water, or when there are these rites of passage in marriage, or a naming ceremony, or a female circumcision ceremony, whatever it is. These rites of passage that are so important in Africa. And they get together and they laugh. And they laugh at their own plight. And when you do talk to them about how difficult it must be to school alone, maybe their husband has gone off to work somewhere in a city, which is a very common phenomenon these days, and disappeared. And all they've got is the community to help them out, maybe give them a bit of land, because in most places women can't own land yet. And they farm and they support these 5 children, and they'll do anything to get their children educated, because that's the only way that they can see the children not having to repeat the difficulties that they've had in their lives.
That sounds like very selfless individuals.
They are incredibly selfless individuals.
We're going to take another short break and round up the end of the show here with Joan Baxter right after this. So thanks for watching our show today. My guest has been Joan Baxter. Joan, you just write about the spirit of Africa. You love the spirit that the people have. How are they different from us in that way?
You know, it sounds so cliche and it sounds so trite, but I keep coming back to it year after year. That, you know, we spend all our time with Africans of different income levels. We have friends who really have nothing, and we have friends who have a living standard equivalent of ours. My children live there. They play constantly with Africans in all of these different income levels, but you feel like you're with family. You feel like it's a community that cares about you, and there's this incredible humor always. Everything is overlaid with this wonderful humor. They're extremely faithful, and things are sacred, but there's this ability to make light of their own plight.
And
I
learn from that.
don't see here. And when I do land in Canada, every year, I don't come every year, but every year when I do come, for the first 2 or 3 weeks, I'm really in shock. I'm in shock because of the excesses and the expectations of what everybody should own materially. And I get over that really quickly, and I start being tempted too. I start going shopping and saying, I want that too. Whereas when I first come, I don't want to buy anything. I don't want to go near those places. And just on the highways with these, when I hear Nova Scotians complaining about roads, it almost makes me laugh. And you know, these streams of Winnebagos and people toting all of this recreation equipment around, that eating up more energy.
We don't need it, you're suggesting. These are all superfluous things.
You know, what is that defining line between need, real need, and having the community and having that spirit, human spirit, and greed and want?
Well, I can hear
which
that you're...
isolates you. And it sounds very much, it's been said before 1,000 times, but it's there, it's real.
And you're obviously happier in Africa when you're there. Well, thanks for coming on our show and sharing this with us.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching the show. I'll see you again next time.